My name is Peter Conti-Brown. I'm an academic fellow at the Arthur and Toni Rembe Rock Center for Corporate Governance. And on behalf of the Rock Center, the Stanford Constitutional Law Center, and Stanford Law School, I want to welcome you to today's conference, When States Go Broke: The Origins, Context, and Solutions for the American States in Fiscal Crisis. We've gathered today some of the country's leading academics and practitioners from a variety of disciplines and backgrounds to talk about a topic of extraordinary, if sometimes forgotten and intermittent importance to the health and well-being of the country and its citizens. And that is, how do we understand and, if possible, resolve the dilemma that state governments face? State governments that, by all accounts, appear unable to meet their obligations to the many claimants, be they employees in the form of wages, pensions, and health care, citizens in the form of infrastructure, education, welfare spending, and nearly every other government service, investors in the form of specific and general debt, and indeed any other individual or institution that interfaces with state governments. At stake in this crisis, in this debate, is the very essence of state government, with the difficult and highly contested questions of what state governments ought to be, what state governments presently are, and how any difference between those two can be bridged in a contentious political climate where few agree on the causes and fewer still on solutions. It's tempting when faced with perennial problems such as state fiscal instability to look for easy solutions. Now, I'll confess my personal favorite would be to figure out a way to involve Team 6 Navy SEALs. Though, as great as those guys are on paper, as I read in the newspaper, it's not exactly clear how they would be helpful for helping the states resolve their fiscal dilemma. But interestingly, the same indeterminacy in questions, more seriously, might be said and have been said about any number of other proposed solutions that have been seriously debated. For example, are federal bailouts of the states political non-starters, or are they predetermined by the nature of our union? Is serious tax reform a frank and inevitable necessity, or is it so politically toxic as to be dismissed out of hand as a first solution? Are unions' collective bargaining rights driving the states over a precipice, or are unions nothing but a tangential figure in this story, paraded out as easy scapegoats by politicians eager to avoid the harder questions at stake? Did President Obama's health care plan save the states, or sell them short? Now, unlike the Navy SEALs, those and related solutions aren't very sexy. They're not very interesting to read about all the time, but nor are they irrelevant to the present conversation. Everything about the states, the question of the state's fiscal crises, is fraught with urgency and controversy. And all the story of the SEALs and their infamous target, among many other stories, have pushed the state of state fiscal problems off the front page. The reality is that this crisis continues unabated. Tens of thousands of protesters filled the streets of Madison, Wisconsin to challenge or support the state's efforts to redefine its relationship with its public employee unions, for example. Legislators in Indiana absconded to Illinois to avoid some controversial votes on the same issue. The state of California began for a time to paying off its debts with colorful IOUs rather than money, simply because they were, as they so frequently aren't, they were not funded. Mayor Bloomberg announced just days ago that he plans to lay off thousands of teachers in an already stretched New York City public school district in order to bridge a gap left by state cuts in Albany. And to put a fine point on it, in a recent report, it was determined that the country of Iraq enjoys a higher credit rating than the state of Illinois. That's true. Now, so in light of these and other facts, we have questions. What does this all mean? How can we understand the state of affairs as a matter of law, politics, and economics? And above all, what can we do about it? Today you'll hear a variety of voices opining on these and related issues. The panelists and speakers taken together agree on almost nothing. Some consider the rhetoric of the conversation and general, even the title of the conference, overblown. Others think the problems are far graver than I've just described. All will contribute to some aspect of this conversation and inform us, challenge our thinking, and encourage us to dig deeper than we've already done to understand what exactly is the nature of the problem that the states face, and what are the options available to the states and the country to resolve it. Now, on that last point, the subtitle of the conference promises an exploration of solutions. My hope is that the panelists today will offer that, will opine on what might be done. But in reality, that's not the focus, and that's not what we invited the panelists to do. Our aim is to highlight underappreciated issues, to provide nuance, context, and develop ideas that, frankly, just can't fit into a newspaper article or political soundbite. We will, however, fully air and debate one proposed solution from some of its leading proponents and opponents. David Skeel, the nation's leading scholar of bankruptcy and financial crises, will follow me this morning, remotely from Philadelphia, to make a case for amending the federal bankruptcy code to allow states to file for voluntary bankruptcy, thus allowing them to restructure their debts in terms that will make them, if nothing else, more realistic under present political scenarios. I'll let him make that case more fully and say only that we will also have an entire panel, one of our 4 panels, devoted to exploring these arguments from those who frankly don't make much of this proposal. But this conference is not about state bankruptcy, but instead about something far better and far more important. It's about the very nature of debt itself, the nature of the states and the relationship to debt, and what both mean in the context of the United States. The American states face a perennial fiscal crisis made painfully obvious each time recession devastates the economy. To quote one of Warren Buffett's perhaps overused nuggets of axiomatic wisdom, you only find out who's swimming naked when the tide goes out. Because of a combination of political, fiscal, and economic factors, the states are chronically swimming naked. This conference represents an effort to, if not to give the states some swimming trunks, then at least to explain the causes and consequences of this perennial preference for skinny dipping. Now, with that tortuously extended metaphor, I'll conclude with the last word about the agenda and format. After these remarks, David Skeel, the S. Samuel Arsh Professor of Corporate Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, will address us remotely on the question of the state of the states and the question of state bankruptcy. After his remarks, the conference will proceed following the agenda that you should all have in your conference book here. Each panelist will have a strictly enforced time limit of 10 minutes, and the moderator will then lead a conversation among panelists for 15 to 25 minutes, followed by 15 minutes for questions from the public. Now, I've asked the moderators to enforce time restrictions with Wilhelmine efficiency, so please don't be offended, either panelists or audience members, if a moderator brusquely cuts you off. We have perhaps a foolishly ambitious agenda before us and hope to be through it all by 5 p.m. Also, due to some unfortunate last-minute flight cancellations, one of our panelists, Marcia Goldstein, on the next panel, won't be joining us in person. So please bear with us while we make a secure connection to her via video conference after David's remarks. So thank you again for coming to what will be, I'm certain, a fascinating conference. Now with that, I will turn it to David in Philadelphia.
I want to apologize for not being able to join you all in person. Only a higher authority could have kept me away from a conference at Stanford Law School with as remarkable a cast of characters as we have today. In this case, a higher authority did. His name is Mike Fitz, and he's my dean. He asked me many months ago to do a panel at our Law Alumni Weekend today, and it was just about the only possible obligation. I couldn't rearrange for the conference, and this turned out to be the only possible day that the conference could be done. So I'll be lurking in the shadows throughout the day, watching the streaming video on this video, and I'll be there for the entire conference except for the hour and a half when I have to do this alumni panel. The other thing I'd like to do at the outset is simply to thank Peter. Although we, I think, theoretically are co-organizers of the conference, Peter has been doing all the organizing, as everyone who's on today's panels knows from the steady stream of emails and correspondence and other communications. Hopefully, I will start pulling my weight as we turn today's proceedings into a book, and the plan is to do that very quickly and to try to get the book out very quickly. So thank you to Peter for putting all of this together and putting together such a wonderful lineup. Thanks too to the Rock Center and to Stanford Law School for making this possible. My original plan was to try to give a full introduction to the wide range of issues we'll be talking about today. Fortunately, Peter has just done that and has flagged some of the issues that folks will be talking about. I figured that a lot of people are probably tired of hearing me talk about the potential benefits of a bankruptcy option for states, and so I wasn't really going to focus on that too much. But it turns out, as Peter also mentioned, that none of the folks on the bankruptcy panel in a little while think there are any benefits to a bankruptcy option. So I figured I probably ought to shift gears and at least try to make a case for how a state bankruptcy option might make things better rather than worse. And that's what I'll be talking about in the next few minutes. What I'll do is make a case in 3 steps. I'll first talk briefly about how bankruptcy for states fits with bankruptcy theory generally, so I'll start on a purely theoretical level. Second, I'll describe several benefits that state bankruptcy might offer. And then finally, I will very quickly address what appear to be the 5 most common objections to a bankruptcy framework for states. Okay, so let me start with the theoretical context. For the past 30 years, the principal theoretical argument for bankruptcy has focused on collective action problems. If I were using PowerPoint slides, I would put up a reference to Douglas Baird and Tom Jackson's creditor's bargain theory, which many of the folks in the room are familiar with at this point in the discussion. The idea is that if creditors are too widely scattered to coordinate, there's a risk that everyone will rush to collect what they're owed. And in the process, even otherwise viable businesses will be dismembered. Starting with the automatic stay, which requires that creditors halt their collection efforts, bankruptcy provides a collective solution to financial distress. Now, as should be pretty quickly evident, states don't fit neatly into this paradigm. Thanks to sovereign immunity and to the difficulty creditors have collecting against a state, the collective action problem doesn't loom nearly as large for a state as for a private corporation. But solving collective action problems is not the only function of a bankruptcy or restructuring framework. The feature that tends to figure most prominently in the finance literature is bankruptcy's role in addressing debt overhang. That is, a situation where excessive debt makes it impossible for the debtor to finance even promising projects. Now, one could argue that a sovereign entity like a state doesn't face the same threat of a debt overhang problem as an ordinary corporation does, since a state's taxing authority gives it an ongoing source of revenue. And with states, nearly every state also is subject to balanced budget requirements. But there obviously is a lot of play in states' balance sheets, as we've seen in the last couple of years. And in my view, they clearly can face a debt crisis, at least under extraordinary circumstances. This problem is very well documented in the finance literature on sovereign debt. And I think the findings are quite relevant to the financial predicament faced by a number of states right now. This brings me to my second topic, the particular benefits of a state bankruptcy regime. Let me very, very quickly run through 4 potential benefits. The first is that the existence of a bankruptcy framework might give a state more leverage to renegotiate its obligations outside of bankruptcy. This is the familiar shadow of the law effect. Note that this suggests that even if the law were rarely used, in fact, even if it were never actually invoked, it could still have a beneficial effect on states' financial predicaments. A second benefit is that bankruptcy would provide an alternative to the 2 existing options in the event a state faced an insurmountable debt crisis. The 2 other options being a federal bailout on the one hand, or simply a state default on the other. Ideally, the existence of state bankruptcy would significantly reduce the pressure for a general federal bailout in the event of a crisis. The state could, of course, play chicken, demanding a bailout as a precondition to invoking the new bankruptcy regime. But I think the pressure for a federal bailout and the risk of complete state default would both be reduced if a state bankruptcy option were in place. A third benefit is that a bankruptcy framework might provide a more coherent system of priorities and property rights for state obligations. Under current law, for instance, some states, Illinois is the most prominent, purport to prohibit any modification to the pensions of existing workers, even with respect to not yet earned benefits, and to treat these obligations as if they're backed by a property right. Yet Illinois has not set aside anywhere near the amount of funds needed to back these promises, so there's a lot of confusion as to exactly what the nature of the property right is, a confusion that I think could easily be sorted out in a bankruptcy context. A final example has to do with the distribution of pain among otherwise similarly situated constituencies in the event that a state's financial crisis spirals out of control. As it currently stands, the pain tends to be visited on one or two constituencies, rather than on everyone. During the current crisis, this has tended to mean cutting back employees' benefits and cutting back services for the poor, while protecting everyone else. Bankruptcy, in my view, could assure a broader and more equitable distribution of the sacrifice. The bankruptcy scholars in the room will recognize that this is a point Elizabeth Warren made about corporate bankruptcy many years ago. So what's not to like about the idea of a bankruptcy framework for states? As I count them, there are 5 major objections, and once again, I'll be quite brief as I go through the objections. The first is simply that state bankruptcy would not be constitutional, that it would violate the 10th Amendment. Now, I'm not a constitutional law scholar. I don't even play one on TV or in front of a live group of students. And I think that Michael McConnell, who will be talking about this later today, and who is, of course, a constitutional law scholar, one of the finest of our time, will explain why he thinks state bankruptcy is unconstitutional. But it seems to me that a state bankruptcy law that makes bankruptcy entirely voluntary, so that a state couldn't be thrown into bankruptcy against its will, would likely be upheld even by a Supreme Court as vigilant to protect state sovereignty as the current Supreme Court. The second objection is that state bankruptcy is unnecessary, because even the most troubled states are likely to muddle through the current crisis. And indeed, the most recent developments are relatively encouraging on that score, at least in California. I think this is true. I think it may be the case that all of the states will ultimately muddle through their crisis, but I don't think that's an adequate basis for rejecting state bankruptcy. As I said earlier, I think the danger of debt overhang is a real concern, even if it's unlikely under most circumstances. Moreover, as we've just seen in the recent crisis, the fact that a catastrophic event is unlikely is not a very good reason not to plan for one. The third of the 5 objections acknowledges that the danger of a crisis that a state can't handle is real, but argues that the states themselves can adopt their own restructuring mechanisms to deal with it. Although the Contracts Clause of the Constitution prohibits a state from interfering with existing contracts, the Supreme Court has upheld measures that are necessitated by a crisis. And there's little doubt, at least in my mind, that a state could adopt a restructuring framework that applied only to contracts entered into after the framework was enacted. Now, I have more sympathy with this third objection to state bankruptcy than I do with any of the others, and it might be fair to say than with all of the others combined, not least because I myself have made precisely these kinds of arguments with respect to corporate bankruptcy in the past, and in particular argued that states could handle corporate bankruptcy. That doesn't necessarily need to be federal. But it also seems to me that the states are limited in this context in a variety of respects. One is that a comprehensive framework probably wouldn't be constitutional, as opposed to a very limited framework dealing with a particular type of debt if it purported to cover existing obligations in addition to future obligations, since the Supreme Court's Contracts Clause exception is quite narrow. In addition, the frameworks that states have used to restructure municipalities under Chapter 9, as probably everybody knows, which already allows cities to file for bankruptcy, as an alternative, many states, or a number of states, have put their own restructuring mechanisms in place. These have been relatively successful, but they've been successful in large part because the states have stood ready to finance the process as it evolved. When the state itself is in crisis, it's much less likely to be able to finance a restructuring process. The fourth objection is that even if state bankruptcy is a great idea in principle, political realities will make it impossible for a state to use the process effectively. Who, for instance, would propose a restructuring plan on behalf of the state? I do think that state bankruptcy would be a lot messier than the bankruptcy of a private corporation, but I think these kinds of concerns and these kinds of issues are far from insuperable. I won't take time to work through the arguments now, but perhaps we'll have a chance to explore them later in the day. The final objection is that the enactment of a state bankruptcy law and its use as well would have devastating effects on the bond markets. This is the contagion argument. This argument has been the main concern of a number of Republicans, but it seems to me to be greatly overstated. The evidence we have thus far suggests that bond markets can tell the difference between a state that's in deep financial doo-doo and one that isn't. A lot is made of a study that suggests that the Orange County bankruptcy a few years ago, back in the 1990s, had a ripple effect on the bond markets. But the study everybody focuses on dealt only with the effect of the actual filing. Just that one day was the focus of the study, and the study itself attributed the effect, even at that one moment, to the opacity of many municipalities' derivatives holdings. This doesn't seem at all to suggest that the markets are incapable of making distinctions. In fact, I think the yields of California and Illinois debt, and Peter very nicely framed the Illinois issue just a few minutes ago, over the past year or so suggest that the markets can. Although the evidence is far from decisive, our experience with the sovereign debt market also seems to me to reinforce this conclusion. Studies of the effect of the introduction of so-called collective action clauses in 2003 into sovereign debt, which provide for a limited form of restructuring, show that the introduction of these clauses had very little effect on the prices of sovereign debt, which may further suggest that a restructuring framework would not mean Armageddon for the bond markets. So how can we decide for sure whether state bankruptcy is or isn't a good idea? I think a key factor will be taking a closer look at the empirical evidence we have, and also trying to develop more systematic data and developing tests that are aimed more directly at these kinds of concerns. One thing I'm trying to do, with a lot of help from a much more sophisticated colleague, is look at the municipal bond markets to see whether the existence of a municipal bankruptcy option, which is allowed by some states but not allowed by other states, is associated with more or less volatile bond markets. We're also planning to look at the political dynamics in states with or without a bankruptcy option for their municipalities, and to see if there's a difference or differences that we can determine. Now, developing compelling data and compelling evidence will be quite difficult, not least because states that don't allow municipal bankruptcy can always change their mind. They can change their mind quite quickly. And in addition, obviously, cities aren't the same things as states. But I do think it may be a way forward, and I hope to have done some of this work by the time we, very quickly, by the time we put the book together. And in the meantime, and I'll conclude on this note in order to stir up the bankruptcy panel a little bit, I think the case for a state bankruptcy option is quite strong. And let me conclude on that note.
Thank you so much to David for his thoughtful remarks, and we'll definitely applaud him. With the stage thus set, and pardon again the interruptions from our next video feed, will be Marcia Goldstein coming in from New York. I'll go ahead and invite Bob Weisberg, who will be moderating the next panel, and his panelists to start talking about the political dimensions of state debt.
Good morning. I was told to fill a little airtime while we set up the feed with Ms. Goldstein, and I'm glad to do so with some empty air, perhaps, because I am, in some ways, the empty suit here. I am the least probable member of this panel. Fortunately, I'm going to quickly revert to my role as fairly invisible timekeeper. I'll introduce our distinguished panelists in a moment, but I thought I would just say why I did actually have an interest in this panel. I do exclusively criminal law these days. The fact that I teach white-collar crime has nothing to do with this. But many years ago, when I first started teaching here, I actually taught commercial transactions and secured debt, not as a scholarly expert, but as a kind of pedagogic hobby. And the school was relieved of this burden once we acquired real colleagues who were real experts, a couple of whom you'll hear from today, Professor Marcus Cole and Professor Dick Craswell. But I did once know something about bankruptcy, and I always thought that Bankruptcy Code 547C5 was the Don Giovanni, the Hamlet of law. But just one other point before we move on. I do teach criminal law, and to the extent I've been involved in practice over the years, it's been on death penalty appeals. Now, what's the connection there? Well, I was pleased to note that my friend David Skeel mentioned the Orange County bankruptcy, which, among other things, produced one of the great potential legal crossovers of all time. Because one of the things that was afflicting county finances in Orange County back in the 90s was a crushing burden of death penalty trials with heavy demands by the public defender's office. It actually reached the point that the public defender was going to be an unsecured creditor in the Orange County bankruptcy, and as a kind of ancillary claim, it was going to bring a kind of class action ineffectiveness of counsel claim in the bankruptcy proceeding. So I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I could use whatever little knowledge I had of bankruptcy and blend it with a Sixth Amendment and an Eighth Amendment claim. Such is my experience in this field. In any event, are we all ready? Okay. I'm happy to introduce this panel about the political context of the questions we're talking about here, and I just think the premise is fascinating, in that even if one could somehow abstractly solve the technical problems of establishing a procedure for state bankruptcy, and even if in some normative sense the questions that David Skeel has raised were settled, it is the understatement of the millennium to say that it has political ramifications, implications, premises and predicates and so on, and we will hear about those today. Okay, so we have three distinguished panelists. Mr. Damon Silvers, as you know, is currently with TARP and has a distinguished career in government dealing with all aspects of financial regulation. Ms. Goldstein, who will be joining us remotely, is of course a partner in the elite firm of Weil, Gotshal and Manges, which is one of the major firms in the world, really, in terms of bankruptcy and particularly in Chapter 11 reorganization. And finally, our own colleague from Stanford, Professor Jonathan Rodden, who is an expert on comparative political economy with a special and, I think, incredibly relevant interest in the role of fiscal responsibility or fiscal incompetence in complex federated political entities. So I believe we're beginning with Damon, is that right?
I guess.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Bob. First, in the interests of everyone understanding who's who and what's what, I'm the policy director of the Afl-Cio. I did serve as the deputy chair of the Congressional Oversight Panel for TARP. That body has recently sunset per statute, and so I'm not a government employee. I speak for in some sense, speak for the labor movement. Today I'm speaking mostly for me. The second thing is, it seems to be, I'm really not that interested in talking about bankruptcy. I'm going to make one observation about it. I don't think it's terribly relevant to this to what is really important here, and that is the larger question of the financing of government in the United States and the functions government plays, and how do we intend to pay for them. Let me just begin by talking a moment about Navy SEALs. I was at a dinner in Brussels a year or so ago with a lot of Germans and Austrians and Danes and French people and so forth who were involved in the European fiscal crisis, and at a high moment Greek drama. And there were a lot of Germans who were very mad at the Greeks. There were no Greeks there, which was a good thing, because if there were, I would have been looking for someplace to hide. The former Chancellor of Austria turned to me and said, how'd you resolve these matters in the United States? You have states, you're a federation of states in some sense. How'd you solve this problem? And I said to him, Abraham Lincoln solved this problem. Now, he didn't have SEALs, but he had the equivalent. And frankly, he solved this problem by force. And by this problem, I mean the question of, is the United States a single economic and political entity, or is it not? Now, in Europe, they have not solved that problem, but we have. And the reason why bankruptcy is a silly question is because of the really total integration. And it's quite apparent when you start looking at the details of the fiscal picture of government in the United States, the total integration of state, federal, and local governments' fiscal pictures. And secondly, because the nature of what would then go on if we started treating states as if they were truly independent or perhaps private. Now, with that sort of preamble, talk about what is the actual, and maybe one other thing about these matters, about the politics of resolving challenging circumstances in government finance. Fundamentally, states are political and not economic entities, meaning that the decision-making that they undertake is fundamentally one done through democratic processes. And in a sense, when one looks at proposals to change that, and there's a fundamental distinction, by the way, in relation to that between states and localities. Because localities' governance is a function of what states say it is. Whereas, at least in our federal system, states are autonomous entities in relation to the governance they set. And beyond that, the truth is that Chapter 9 municipal bankruptcy is relatively trivial in terms of its impact, Orange County aside, in terms of its impact on the way municipal finance problems have been solved. What we start talking, we're essentially, this conversation in a certain sense is about a despair among some audiences, and much of that despair seems to be concentrated in private institutions. A despair about the ability of political processes to resolve things and a desire to turn to some kind of non-political, non-democratic authority. Now, what is the nature of state fiscal problems? There's a very good article about this that was authored during what people thought was a serious set of state fiscal crises in 2003 by Alice Rivlin from the Brookings Institution, who lays out that basically what we've done is that since around 1960, we have, as a nation, given responsibility for profound counter-cyclical government programs to the states without giving them a capacity to borrow during economic downturn. And the most obvious example of this is Medicaid, but the other ones that should be quite familiar to people are unemployment insurance, and a whole range of government programs that were pushed down to the states and then funded in part or in whole through federal block grants under Reagan's new federalism. And so if you look at what has happened in the states over the last 2 or 3 years, fundamentally state budget gaps are driven by things like the 20% increase in Medicaid enrollments that's occurred since the beginning of 2008, and that's expected to continue to occur over the next couple of years. The something like $20 to $30 billion increase on an annual basis in unemployment insurance claims paid by the states. Actually, that's not the increase. That's the spread between revenues and payouts in the unemployment insurance programs during these periods. The other side of it is what happens to state tax revenues. Since you can't borrow, the question is what happens to state tax revenues during economic downturns. In aggregate, state tax revenues in 2008-2009 fell by about $75 billion. Now, when you add that and those numbers to the Medicaid numbers and the unemployment insurance numbers, you're well north of 50% of the budget gap. Now, a lot of this has been hidden by what I referred to earlier, the integration of state and federal finances through programs like FMAP, where the federal government has stepped up and funded some of the increase in Medicaid. But the other side of this is a structural problem in state taxation. States' tax systems are primarily state income taxes and state sales taxes. They are significantly integrated, particularly with respect to education, with local tax systems that are largely property tax-based. This has meant two things. One is, over the long run, state sales taxes have been impacted by a shift to the service economy, which has not generally been addressed by state tax policy. Right? And state income taxes have been affected by a secular dismantling of progressive income taxation in the United States, both at the state and the federal level, over a generation. At the local level, this state pioneered the notion that we don't really need to have local property taxation in any significant economically viable way. And a lot of that decision was then covered up for by state funding of localities. Think about it for a moment. Property taxation as a source of funding means you're very dependent on real estate prices. There's been a little problem with real estate prices recently. These are sort of essentially structural issues involved in state finance. And on top of them, we are now living through a period of high, sustained unemployment, as I mentioned earlier, falling real estate prices, of a type that we have not seen since the modern obligations created for states were put in place. And I don't mean just the Great Society era obligations or the Reagan era New Federalism obligations. I mean going right back to the New Deal. That this period really is a shockingly unprecedented period of prolonged unemployment and economic both economic contraction and then slow economic growth. If this recession had looked like any of the prior modern recessions, right, we would not be having this conversation today. We would have seen the state fiscal picture recover, 18 months, 2 years. Now, therefore, the real question is, how is it going to be possible to have a conversation about both on the revenue side and on dealing with the issue of states' poor design to be a counter-cyclical source of expenditures? How do you have that political conversation? That is the real issue confronting us. Now, there is also another issue which has been raised as an alternative political agenda in relationship to what I just described. And that is the proposition that state employees, public employees, right, should essentially not be middle-class people. That's what the fight in Wisconsin, Ohio, and so forth is about. And a lot of analysis of state wages and all that. Most of them basically show that while you can quibble around the details, state employees are paid roughly what other people are paid in our largely middle-class society. The structure of state employment compensation is different and is a bit weighted toward benefits compared to what people get in the private sector. But the overall economics are similar. Now, that battle is about a whole different set of questions about what type of labor market, what type of income distribution, what type of economic security we wish to have to be standard in the United States. But it's not really that serious a conversation in relationship to state fiscal problems, which are driven by the factors I just described primarily. And once you understand that, then you understand that And by the way, there's also a final conversation about infrastructure finance, which is largely what the bonding issues with bonds and debt instruments in the state context are about. If you separate all these things out, you understand that we are not having here a conversation about debt overhang. What we are having here is a conversation about the inability of the U.S. political process to make the decisions necessary to finance in an appropriate, sustainable way the modern government the American people expect to have. Now, it would be a terribly dangerous and stupid thing to do, to either try to resolve that problem by essentially seeking to push public employees into an underclass. It simply won't solve the problem, not doable. Or by attempting to revisit the questions that Abraham Lincoln resolved. Those would be foolish things to do. They simply, A, they would do great social damage to our country, political damage to our country, and B, they simply wouldn't address what the real issues are here. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And by the way, we'll proceed to hear the 10-minute presentations by our other panelists, and then we'll do some interactive conversation and have some Q&A. So we'll turn to Ms. Goldstein in New York. Hello.
Well, one, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. One, thank you very much for allowing me to participate by video conference. My woes in terms of getting to Stanford Law School were, I'll blame it on Delta Airlines, which delayed the flight, and therefore I missed a critical connection to San Francisco. I was coming from Charleston, South Carolina. And I've been asked to talk about the political implications in private company, or not private company, but in non-governmental restructurings. Delta Airlines itself went through Chapter 11, and there were clearly political considerations, ranging from their labor issues to trying to fend off a potential takeover attempt by U.S. Air. And don't think for a minute that that was not embroiled in politics, engaging the mayor of Atlanta and the local politicians, and work done lobbying through the halls of Congress to make sure U.S. Air, I won't comment on the labor issue because I'm not as familiar with it, getting the word back to U.S. Air this wasn't going to happen, at least from an HSR point of view. I open with that because that Delta Airlines on my mind. But if you look at the politics of restructuring, and I'll talk about how that translates in a very obvious way to the states, you know, it's not absent from the restructuring world that I practice in terms of Chapter 11, and not all, but many corporate entities that have to go through Chapter 11. I could start with the most obvious recent experience of General Motors. You know, that was a situation where clearly supercharged with political considerations. The filing of General Motors came on the heels of the financial crisis. In the fall of 2008, Lehman had already failed and was in a Chapter 11 that at least, and again, I speak for myself, just as Mr. Silvers does, Chapter 11 that should have never happened. And that's probably a comment against interest since we represented Lehman Brothers and continue to represent Lehman Brothers in the Chapter 11 case. But General Motors itself was in the midst of a severe liquidity crisis aggravated by conditions in 2008. And its ability to continue operations became increasingly uncertain. So what are the politics around that? Well, as I understand it, and my guess is Mr. Silvers probably has even more information, 1 in 10 American workers would have been affected by a General Motors bankruptcy. Not just General Motors employees, but the entire automotive sector and the many, many businesses that depended upon the automotive sector. Essentially, we were talking about systemic risk, not what we talk about in the Dodd-Frank discussions, but Main Street systemic risk. And what occurred from a political point of view, or politically speaking, was a bailout with strings attached that was implemented through a Chapter 11 proceeding, which was unprecedented in terms of its speed, in terms of what occurred. And it would be hard to say that the bankruptcy judge wasn't somewhat influenced, although the bankruptcy court found good legal precedent for its decision. wasn't influenced by the politics around the situation. So before General Motors filed, it had already borrowed $17 billion from the federal government. And in connection with providing its financing, the U.S. Treasury advised General Motors that, look, if an out-of-court restructuring was not possible, then it had to consider a bankruptcy process to implement a transaction under which substantially all the assets of General Motors would be purchased by a U.S. Treasury-sponsored purchaser, essentially the federal government. It was done through a process in the bankruptcy court that is typically used in situations where a prompt sale is needed, Section 363. It was subject to higher and better bid, but I think all parties knew that there would be no higher and better bid. Essentially, we were looking at a $50 billion credit bid by the federal government, $17 billion loaned pre-bankruptcy, $33 billion approximately in credit extended for post-petition financing. So we have here a situation highly political. It moved through the bankruptcy court with extraordinary speed. Concern for the American consumer who would buy a car while General Motors, who would buy a car from General Motors while it's in bankruptcy. What concerns would there be over the warranties? That was a big issue for GM, which the federal government agreed with. But the government, or the Treasury, didn't just act alone. And this is one of the points I'm going to try to translate to state bankruptcy. They set up a commission with parties, with individuals who had experience, financial professionals, union representation, legal professionals who would work with the Treasury and the federal government in connection with what I would call their management of the General Motors bankruptcy. So while General Motors management was running the company, there were a lot of purse strings being exercised by the debtor in possession lender, as I would call the federal government. So while in a typical private restructuring, it could be a J.P. Morgan, or it could be any other lender in the dip lender shoes, and they would have some control because they're extending the post-petition loans over spending and over the direction of the Chapter 11 debtor. And General Motors was clearly an example of that type of control. You know, the Lehman bankruptcy, I'm not going to talk about because, you know, I view that bankruptcy as a political mistake as well as a financial mistake. But obviously, maybe there weren't enough politics around that one. And perhaps it was that or the consequences of the Lehman bankruptcy that led to the very controversial AIG bankruptcy. Excuse me, AIG bailout. And the view was that bankruptcy was not an option for an AIG, and I know that's debatable, but I think that, again, there was a concern with AIG of a Main Street as opposed to a Wall Street systemic risk. And to me, that is a politically driven decision. Now, I'm going to turn to cases that you don't think about because I've mentioned General Motors, I've mentioned Lehman, mentioned the AIG bailout. These are all occurring during our financial crisis of 2008 to 2009. But I mentioned Delta. I mean, that was a different situation. And I can mention WorldCom, which in 2002 was a very major failure, if you will, but it reorganized. And what were the political issues around WorldCom? Well, for one, you know, it was the largest corporate fraud in history at the time. I think it still probably has that record. And so one could say, well, what are the political considerations? It should have gone into bankruptcy. It did go into bankruptcy, but it didn't go into bankruptcy per se because of the fraud. It went into bankruptcy because the fraud resulted in a critical liquidity crisis for a worldwide telecom and internet provider. Yes, there was a fraud. The issues, the political issues that emerged were its largest competitor using political connections in Congress to try to force legislation or force a situation where a company that committed a fraud would not be allowed to reorganize. Well, we had to respond to that, including myself testifying in Congress as to the purposes of the bankruptcy, having not on behalf of the company, but in the same hearing, Professor Douglas Baird from University of Chicago testified about the purposes of bankruptcy. And while that doesn't seem so political, the company had to mount a large lobbying effort through federal agencies as to its own importance. You know, sometimes we focus a lot on too big to fail. Sometimes there's too important to fail. This is 2002. It was the sole internet provider to many governmental agencies, including Social Security Administration, Department of Defense, Pentagon. Very critical supplier. Very critical in terms of a counterparty to government contracts. So how do you deal with a company like that committed a fraud? Well, you punish those who committed the fraud, and you have to exercise all of your political clout to help the company maintain its contracts, help the company survive a reorganization, and ultimately achieve a fair price in a sale to one of its competitors. And the creditors who didn't cause the fraud were ultimately the beneficiaries of that. That's a different kind of political consideration, but it does occur. And even in any type of a case, from the very first discussion with a client, we talk about the proper venue for a case. And one consideration will be, what will be the political climate in your home court? Will it be an advantage or a disadvantage? Will it be an advantage if you're the largest employer in your town? Will it be a disadvantage because you're going to reject a union contract and everybody in the town will be very upset with you? So there are a number of what I would consider political considerations that drive private restructurings. So what about the states? Well, I think it's obvious, and speaking for myself, and I'm going to join in Mr. Silver's comment, I don't think that bankruptcy, just going to get that out on the table, is a useful or appropriate solution for states, and I know that there will be other panels talking about how it could work or not work, and the constitutionality issues. So I will just talk about some of the practical political implications of it. You know, there's $2.8 trillion of municipal debt out there. That's state and municipalities. More than 2/3 of that is held by individuals, either directly or through mutual funds. So right off the bat, look at the analogy of General Motors. 1 in 10 American workers could be affected by this. 2/3 of that $2.8 trillion of debt would be held by Main Street America. So for me, that's the first political consideration. And notwithstanding Newt Gingrich saying, look, you know, California, Illinois, New York, the hell with you, reminds me of, you know, Gerald Ford saying that to New York City in the 1970s. That's not the solution, and you can see how politically driven that is. You know, those are, excuse me, not the right color states. So there's a lot of politics around whether or not there should be bankruptcy for states. Shouldn't bail out states for being told by certain members of Congress they should be able to go bankrupt. They're not like corporate entities. Impairing debt in a corporate entity has the result that the debt holders receive something. They receive ownership. There's an exchange, there's a transfer of ownership that goes on in a corporate bankruptcy that is not going on and cannot go on in a state bankruptcy. Obviously doesn't go on in a municipal bankruptcy. But, you know, municipal bankruptcies, I agree again with Mr. Silvers, are insignificant. In the last 30 years, there have been 250 uses of Chapter 9. Bear in mind, most of those uses are by, you know, water districts, not too many cities. And it is very rare that you would impair the bond debt issued by a municipality. One, impairing the bond debt is not like impairing debt in a corporate entity. ability for a municipality to access credit markets after that could be impaired. I won't say it will be impaired, but certainly if there were a rash of cities and if there were a state bankruptcy, a contagion of states filing for bankruptcy, you're just going to aggravate the fiscal crisis because the cost of debt for those instrumentalities, municipalities, states, whatever they are, would certainly go up. The history is, we thought we represented, Orange County was mentioned, we represented the bondholders, or a bondholder group in that case, and we thought we did a great job because they got paid in full. But history shows bondholders typically are not impaired in a municipal bankruptcy. So I suppose we did the right job. If we hadn't gotten them paid in full, it wouldn't have been right at all. So why does a municipality file for bankruptcy? It's typically to get out from under a union contract. There's a big judgment. On its face, Chapter 9 is an easier vehicle than Chapter 11 in terms of rejecting union contracts because it does not have the requirements of Section 1113, although there are different requirements for entering Chapter 9, which go to good faith and require previous negotiations. And I won't go through all that, not my subject. But nonetheless, I question whether Chapter 9 has been an effective tool. I don't see it as a political solution even for municipalities. So how do you transfer that to the state? The state has taxing authority. I'm told, I don't know if it's true, that if in California they raise taxes by an additional 2%, that would eliminate the deficit. I think that states, while they cannot legislate themselves out of debt obligation, they certainly can do things less than a bankruptcy to help themselves. Unlike municipalities, they have complete taxing authority. And also, they could, if they had to, under certain conditions, legislate extensions of debt. Historically, that has been done. I don't think that's ideal. They have legislated or passed legislation that affects collective bargaining rights of public employees. I'm not suggesting that's right either. But nonetheless, I think that a state can take actions. It can privatize various infrastructure, toll roads. That certainly has been done. Airports. There are pockets of revenue in the states that can be accessed. We are going into a period now where, and again, I think that the politicians are overreacting to perhaps short-term deficits versus long-term need to satisfy obligations. During the fiscal crisis, obviously, income and, more importantly, sales taxes were hurt. Consumer spending, if I had a slide here, I would show you the graph with consumer spending during the fiscal crisis. The dip was obviously extraordinary. So the tax revenue in the various states is critically impaired. Consumer spending, I know some have said we're just in a Wall Street recovery, but I have seen a slide as late as yesterday showing consumer spending, the flip side, is gone considerably up since the fiscal crisis. So sales taxes will be back. California is finding more revenue. I'm sure New York will find more revenue. I think that the politics of a state filing would be a negative. I think I'm pretty clear on that. I think finding the right way for a bankruptcy court to manage a state bankruptcy would be fraught with political issues. You would essentially be taking some authority away from elected officials who could probably use some better professional financial help in terms of managing their fiscal situations. But I don't think that you're going to see a bankruptcy court being able to, both constitutionally or practically, being able to interfere in the fiscal activity of a state. Even in Chapter 9, basically a state is left to its normal political operations. It's allowed to continue to pay whoever it has to pay not have the same effect as a corporate restructure. So it is very hard for me to see, both politically and practically, that a state bankruptcy would be an effective way to resolve any current fiscal crisis that the state finds itself in.
Thank you very much.
First, say thank you. This is a really important topic, and it's nice to have this kind of forum to discuss these things. I want to move the conversation in a little bit different direction and try to look a bit at the bigger picture. I feel like it's one thing to ask about the medium term or short-term prospect of states going broke, or the possibility of a bailout or some kind of a default. I want to think in the longer term about how do you structure a properly functioning system of fiscal federalism in a multi-layered system. And so I want to think about, sometimes you make decisions in the short term, and we think about the bailouts and some of the things that have flowed from those. Sometimes in the short term, what is a solution really can turn into something quite different in the long run. And so I think it's very useful. We can't really talk much longer about this topic without thinking about the European Union. So I want to do a little bit of that. And I'm glad that that this kind of framing with the Austrian Chancellor at dinner was already brought in. Because I was at meetings like this more like 2 years ago with Europeans. So yeah, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, of course, thought that Greece and Ireland were going to be fine. But there were actually people in Europe who were very worried. And there was a conference just like this in Brussels before things really started to get bad. And one of the reasons they wanted to bring a bunch of Americans over is they wanted to hear about bankruptcy. They wanted to think about municipal bankruptcy as a potential solution to where they saw things heading in Europe. So that's one question. I'm not going to make a strong kind of case for or against bankruptcy. I'm going to try to lay out the kind of debate in a little bit different way. And it's one in which the costs and benefits of bankruptcy might be viewed in light of the kind of this question. What if the European Union had adopted some kind of a bankruptcy procedure, something like what is referred to now as orderly defaults? Some kind of an infrastructure for that would have been in place before the Greek crisis emerged. It's a question that's worth pondering. So what I want to start, though, I want to think about the basic problem. It's one that was recognized by Hamilton and quite a few others. Basic problem in a federal system is when you've got a higher level government that has deep pockets and has the potential to solve the problems of lower level units at some point when they hit fiscal crisis. So it's kind of for those who like game theory, it's a dynamic game of incomplete information where you're making decisions at the lower level without knowing further down the game tree what will happen in the event of a default. Will the federal government provide a bailout or not? And there's always this uncertainty about that, and all the market actors have some kind of probability they associate with the likelihood of eventual default. And everyone's kind of operating under some set of assumptions about this. And then we often, we don't know what's going to happen until the tide goes out, of course. But there's this basic problem that if everyone believes that the federal government will bail out the subnational entities, of course, then they will have bad incentives and they will misbehave. And if we have more time, I can tell you lots of stories about Brazil and Argentina in this respect. This is a big problem, and it happens often. Of course, it's now the problem facing the European Union. So the question, I don't know if this is the question that the Austrian Chancellor was asking, but if he was asking, how did the United States solve that problem, I think I would have given him a very different answer. And it's with apologies to Oliver Williamson, there's a sort of a choice between hierarchy and markets, and I think the United States, kind of by accident, chose the route of market discipline for subnational entities. And Merkel tried. She wanted to move in this direction, and for reasons I'll discuss in a moment, failed. And so the European Union, much like the way Brazil solved its state government debt crisis in the 1990s, the European Union is going down the route of hierarchy, trying to regulate the finances of, essentially, they want to do something like put Greece in receivership. And I want to suggest that that's not possible. You can't put a sovereign government into anything like receivership. And this way of dealing with the European debt crisis, I think, is troubling. But I think in the United States, we have a different option, we have a different possibility, a different history, and I want to argue that it started in the 1840s. It didn't start, Alexander Hamilton basically didn't believe the states should have the autonomy to borrow independently. He believed that the states should be something like corporations of the, sort of like arms of the central government, and that borrowing power should be vested in the center. And the first thing he did upon assuming office was to assume the Revolutionary War debts. the states. So there's this kind of moment in the history of federations. Debt crises are really important moments. I can talk to you about Vargas in Brazil. I can talk to you about the history of Argentina, Mexico, Germany. There are moments in which a debt crisis is used to centralize fiscal authority. And that's what's happening in the European Union right now. It's being used as this idea to sort of think this is a moment when we can build up a more integrated European market. And so I want to play devil's advocate a little bit here and think about this question of whether bankruptcy, in fact, could potentially, one of the benefits I think that hasn't really been discussed is something like, and it doesn't have to be a simple extension of existing municipal bankruptcy procedures, it could be something very different, some sort of orderly default process that we can start from kind of a blank slate and think about how you might arrange such a thing. Is there some way to communicate to market actors that in fact the central government does not stand behind the obligations of the states? I think I'm going to try to convince you that the federal government does not currently do that. This is controversial, and it's certainly something we can have a debate about, and that it would be useful to underscore that, because we are at a moment right now when the German government explicitly guarantees the debt issues of Ireland and Greece, and that is a very dangerous situation that I don't think we're in yet in the United States. I think we could avoid it if we do things right. So I want, 1840s, there was this debt crisis, which had many kind of, to me, had a lot of the flavor of the current European crisis. And so the role of Greece was played by Pennsylvania. So the Reverend Sidney Smith, who has lots of great things to say about lots of things, but no conduct was ever more profligate than that of the state of Pennsylvania. History cannot pattern it, let no deluded being imagine that they will ever repay a single farthing. People have tasted the dangerous luxury of dishonesty, and they'll never be brought back to the homely rule of right. So you have this kind of a bunch of states, including Pennsylvania, who had borrowed a lot for infrastructure projects, and then were facing there was a fiscal crisis. They were facing default, and there was a movement afoot for a bailout. And so I want to argue this is a really important moment in U.S. fiscal history. There was a proposal for a big bailout, which was eventually never even made it to the floor for a vote. It didn't happen, even though Britain was actually threatening war with the United States if the federal government did not assume the debts, because many of the creditors were British. And speaking about the political economy of bailouts, this is an important fact, I think, that the creditors were mostly British citizens. The bailout never happened, and we entered a very different type. So this is like the European crisis, and it ended in a very different way. Basically, there was no bailout. There was nothing really from the federal government. There were defaults, and of course it was horrible. And states were moved from the federal government couldn't borrow for several years, in fact. But then eventually states wanted to re-enter the credit markets, and they did a bunch of things, and those legacies are still with us. So they shored up the tax base. This is really the dawn of certain types of direct taxation in the states. They adopted these balanced budget requirements. This is where these things come from. It's from the 1840s crisis. That's where all of this starts. And that's a legacy I'll talk about in a moment. But it's sort of like Argentina, and eventually you were able to get back into the credit markets. Eventually it's possible to borrow again. And thereafter, I think everyone learned an important lesson, that the states are, in fact, miniature sovereigns. They're not simple kind of arms of the central government. And you have to be careful when you're lending money to states, because they might default. It's entirely possible. And so we've developed this whole industry around trying to understand the creditworthiness of states. So to echo what other people have said, I think the market is not bad at figuring out what the underlying fiscal situation is for many states. Okay, so what happened in Europe? I don't want to dwell on this. I think many of you know. Europe, it was never clear whether Europe was trying to depend on market discipline or some kind of hierarchy. They had sort of half-hearted efforts at both. There was a no bailout clause that people were not sure if it was credible. There was also an excessive deficit procedure, which was clearly not credible, in that the fees and fines were never really applied properly. But then, it's all seemed to be going well. I mean, so these are just bond yields. And so to some people, this is a good thing. To me, it's sort of a bad thing, in that over time, there'd be some key moments in the history of the euro. You see that eventually the bond yields are tightly clustered together. So the markets started to see Greek debt as essentially German debt. I think I'm going to argue to a greater extent than the markets see Illinois debt as as Texas debt. And so changed, the people were shocked by this. The fiscal crisis comes about, and all of a sudden you see this big divergence in bond yields. And this is when we had the conference in Brussels, and everyone started worrying, what's going on? This is not supposed to happen. We're part of we're part of this common currency union. And so markets started to figure out that maybe Greek debt is not quite the same thing as German debt. And so then you have this big divergence. And eventually you see these dips in the Greek and in the Greek bond yields. And of course, those are the moments when bailouts happened. But you see, it was only temporary. You announce a big bailout, and it goes down, and then people start to get worried again. Maybe the bailout's not big enough. Maybe it's not credible enough. And so then it kind of keeps inching up. And I want to argue this is not where the United States wants to end up. So, right now the idea, this is what I think is very relevant for our conversation. Merkel tried to introduce the idea of orderly default. Let's try to deal with this by allowing the Greeks to partially default, take a haircut, and not have a run, not have a complete, everything fall apart. And the way to do this is to kind of have some order to the process. Let's come up with some sort of way of producing orderly defaults. Every time she opened her mouth and said the word orderly default, I want to collect the data and do this because I think it'll be nice. Every time she said that, or one of her people said that, the euro took a huge dive, and the bond yields went way up. And the credit default swaps went way up. And so eventually, she said it 3 or 4 or 5 times. It happened every time. Eventually, she just stopped saying it. And so this is off the table. And so now the idea is this sort of putting Greece in receivership sort of idea. We're going to try to get these Greeks under control. We're going to have hierarchical. It's very unclear to me how that's going to work in a system of sovereign states. All right. So where does this all have to do with the United States? Where do we stand? And this is a question a lot of people are asking. Is California like Greece? So you can watch 60 Minutes. There was a star analyst recently who went on and said, 100 states and municipalities are going to default imminently, any day now. And, it's going to be terrible. And so that kind of idea seems to be that the federal government does not stand behind their debts, and they will default. Market discipline, in effect, still works. But some other people who know some things, Nouriel Roubini and Warren Buffett, make the kind of reasonable claim that in the wake of Bear Stearns, GM, and so forth, the federal government could not possibly tell California to go to hell. They would step up and provide a bailout. And I think we don't necessarily, I think that initially I told you about this game of incomplete information where you're kind of assessing the probability of eventual bailout. I think there's a lot of uncertainty. People really don't know. And so according to this view, though, forget about it. Market discipline can't work. The markets are already kind of pricing in, already believe in some kind of implicit bailout. I want to suggest the data are not consistent with that view. So first of all, just to be clear, this is just debt as a share of GDP, and of course, that's not a good measure because we know that there are all these unfunded pension liabilities. And the reason why there are a lot of unfunded pension liabilities, of course, is because we have these balanced budget requirements that go back to the 1840s. And when you want to kind of do something, it's not as easy to borrow, so it's easy to just not fund your pensions. That's one of the things that happens. But even if you add in the unfunded pension liabilities, I don't think we're going to, these are the US states over here, these are European member states. The debt GDP ratios are not in the same ballpark. But also, I just wanted to just to look at some credit default swaps. This point's already been made, so I'll move quickly. The markets have not been kind to California and Illinois, and in fact, I think they're both in the top 10 for credit default swap spread basis points in the entire world. They're viewed as a better credit risk than Nicaragua and a bunch of, worse credit risk than Nicaragua and a bunch of other places. So I don't think market actors are viewing the states as already kind of implicitly bailed out by the central government. So I think market discipline is still a possibility. I think it's still possible that states can be forced to deal with their problems on their own by the kind of its need to react to voters and creditors rather than kind of centralized legislation. And I think that the idea that everyone kind of knows there'll be a bailout, I think, is hard to support. But there are some reasons to worry, and this is going to bring me into some things that some others have already been mentioning. Okay, so we haven't had yet anything like, there was, California tried, they kind of tried to solve their problems a couple summers ago by sort of waiting and asking for a federal bailout. They wanted to issue a bunch of debt, and they wanted the federal government to guarantee it, and Obama said no, which to me seemed like a good outcome. But there are, I think they're increasingly, this is this point that Damon made about kind of the increasingly intertwined nature of American federalism. So this story I told you about the 1840s, this is not the 1840s anymore. Since the New Deal in the 1960s, yes, the states have become increasingly intertwined with the finances of the federal government. And so the question is, in that context, can we still count on market discipline to kind of guide the decisions of the states? And so, we've had this sort of slow, persistent growth of the federal government, and it's involved with the states. And so this is kind of echoes much of what you just heard. This is kind of the growth of federal grants as a share of current expenditures. You see from the 20s to recently, it's grown quite a lot, but still less than 25%. And that's actually, in the world, that's pretty low. 25% of revenues coming from grants. If you look at all the universe of federations and other multi-layered systems, that's still relatively low. And so I want to argue it's still low enough that I think market discipline can work. I think if this number is 80%, forget it. You have to do something hierarchical like most unitary systems do. So this gets me into just the last couple of policy issues. There's this problem which we ended up with these balanced budget requirements going back to the 1840s. And then we have this incredibly pro-cyclical system of grants, and of course the revenue, and I've collected data on this for mostly all the major federations. They all have highly pro-cyclical revenue streams. Some of them have some more counter-cyclical grants. Our grants tend to be rather pro-cyclical. And so every recession we have this problem. We have the balanced budget requirements. We have everything, revenue collapses. So there's this mad scramble to fire the teachers and the police officers and so forth. And we go to Washington and we try to get some kind of ad hoc bailouts. And when things get bad enough, we get these sort of stimulus or some Medicaid supplement, something short term. And this is not a good way. This kind of ad hoc scramble is just not a good way forward. And so to me, the bigger question is, whatever we do in the short term to try to solve this problem, how are we going to structure this longer term? How are we going to try to rearrange the basic architecture of U.S. federalism to solve some of these problems? I don't have any more time, but one thing that no one ever talks about is getting rid of the balanced budget requirements. I gather everybody likes those, but that's one thing that some states might put on the table. I've never heard of anyone even discussing it, but. One thing that could happen is this: we could place limitations on the way in which central governments intervene in state finances, limitations on unfunded mandates, find some ways of dealing with that, some mechanism for making the existing grants. I think this is something people on the right and the left really shouldn't have to, this is something people should agree on. Take whatever grants you're going to have and try to make them a little bit less ad hoc and sort of discretionary, and try to make the grant programs less likely to be pro-cyclical. And so then I just want to end with this idea of a bankruptcy. And I'm not really making a strong case for or against, but the one thing I do want to say is that the U.S. system of market-based fiscal discipline, where the states are quasi-sovereign and their creditworthiness is carefully examined by creditors, and it's also something that voters pay attention to, that this is something worth protecting. It's something unique in the world. I think to some extent the Canadian Federation has achieved this, and to some extent the Swiss Federation has achieved it. In most other places, the idea that the subnational entity is kind of a sovereign doesn't work. And if you look at the credit ratings and the bond yields, they're tightly clustered into the Spanish autonomous communities or the Austrian states or the German states. They're tightly clustered around the standalone rating of the federal government. In the US, as I've shown you, this is not the case. There's a lot of heterogeneity. I think market discipline can work in the US, and it needs to be protected. So we need to communicate that unlike the situation with Greece and Ireland and Portugal and Spain, Illinois and California are, their debt issues are their own. And that bailouts are really, explicit kind of federal bailouts are not really on the table. And this is something this is one of kind of the hidden perhaps advantages of something like, maybe not an obvious and simple extension of existing procedures, but is there some sort of a set of procedures where everyone knows that default is an option, some kind of a haircut is possible, and that creditors should behave accordingly? Is there some way of communicating this through some process where it's not a disorderly rush, where some of the advantages you heard in that presentation that come from bankruptcy can be had, where it's possible, everyone knows default is possible, but they also know that there's a procedure, and this is a procedure that will be rule-based, it's in place, it works, And this is how defaults will be arranged. Again, I want to end with this question. What if Europe had such an institution before the Greek crisis unfolded? It seems implausible to me that there could have been something like a Greek partial default without this buildup without the situation that Europe is in now, where market discipline is no longer even on the table. It's going to be a hierarchical kind of top-down federation or nothing. And I would submit that in the European Union, that kind of hierarchy, treating a European member state as if it was a U.S. municipality going into receivership like Michigan, I think that's not really going to work. So I think a solution in which the states maintain their sovereignty is the kind of solution that needs to be discovered in the U.S. And something like some kind of codified rule-based procedure through which default takes place might not be a bad thing to have on the table. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Rodden. For the next phase, I'd like to provoke some discussion among our panelists, and then we can bring in the audience. I'll just make a quick observation of a couple of themes, or several themes I've heard so far, which may or may not frame some commentary by the panelists. At a certain level of generality or abstraction, everybody agrees that there's a political context for call it default, insolvency, bankruptcy, or that these questions are political as well as economic. But what that blending means is a different matter from different perspectives. In a sense, Mr. Silvers suggests that looking at default as a core problem, if not the core problem, is looking at a symptom of a complex political disease of economic injustice, and that it's therefore the wrong way to address the real problems. Ms. Goldstein emphasizes that there are serious choices to be made as to whether let's say Chapter 11 is a good idea or not, and by analogy, public bankruptcies, because one has to keep in mind the political implications. And I think, her commentary raises some fascinating questions about where the line is between politics and economics, and how we finesse those. Finesse that distinction conceptually, because of course at a certain point, and the very term political economy sort of captures this blurring or blending. At a certain point, if we're asking whether the risks of a bankruptcy proceeding or a default proceeding are too great because of ripple effects, sure, there's a simple way of capturing the political problem. It'll look bad for officials who want to get reelected, but I think Ms. Goldstein talks about, deeper implications where the line between the political and the economic, the ripple effects, are much more complicated. I find it really fascinating that Professor Rodden gets at this question from a couple of angles, more than a couple, but I'll just mention two. First, he emphasizes that although he's clearly not necessarily in favor of any particular formal proceeding to address debt issues, the fact is that formal proceedings can actually be the occasion or the opportunity for some creative rethinking of political structures. So it's possible that we don't view a formal proceeding as a huge separation of powers problem or taking things away from democratic government, but a kind of catalytic experiment where we do some tweaking with a governmental mechanism to see if it induces some creative thinking about a larger and democratically based restructuring. But another implication of his remarks I thought was quite striking, and that is, and it's related, I think, to Mr. Silver's, worry that we may be seeing insolvency and the need for some kind of formal proceeding where it really isn't there, or where it's the wrong way of looking at things. And as Professor Rodden says, when you actually look at debt to GDP ratios of American states, gee, they don't really look that terrible. Is there something inherently political and politically contestable about the very characterization of a debt crisis, and so on? So I guess I'll invite our panelists to talk to each other, but I guess the point of that quick superficial summary is to just raise some questions about whether you think you're on the same page or on similar pages about what it means to look at these issues in a political context. So, Damon? Sure, in any order you'd like.
I mean, I think Jonathan and I are having the same conversation, for starters. I think that we may see these issues somewhat differently, but we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about, on the one hand, this question of what exactly is the relationship between the fiscal relationship between states and the federal government in the United States. Is the United States a federation? I think is one way of asking that question. So we are definitely having the same question there, and we're also having the same conversation about the dysfunctionality of the way in which state fiscal structures relate to economic cycles. And then the question of what role will the federal government play there. Absolutely the same conversation. I want to observe something about private bankruptcy and public and issues of public fiscal policy in the last few years. I think it's really remarkable, right, that some aspects of the sort of American policy intellectualdom are sort of toying around with the notion of public sector bankruptcy. And this conference, I suppose, is some evidence of that. At the same time as it's become clear that whatever one may say, we are absolutely not going to allow our private financial institutions to go bankrupt. The completely, I think, dishonest discussion about what went on with Lehman Brothers that's gone on since then. The rescue using public funds of successively, and by rescue I don't mean simply the debts, I mean the equity, right? Successively of, to a small degree, AIG, and then to a very large degree, Citigroup, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley. The latter two, which were rescued from their short-term funding issues by the combination of the second-degree effects of the rescue of the earlier institutions and then the Fed coming in. What that tells us is that we really don't like to put those particular institutions through a genuine bankruptcy proceeding. It's just not going to happen. And yet we're thinking about doing it in the public sector. Now, what does that tell us? What could we learn from that? One thing we might learn from it is that in the 1970s, we clearly, as a nation, were unwilling to put the big three automakers through bankruptcy. The Chrysler bailout was that message. We're not doing that. In 2009, we did that. Chrysler, GM. I think you're looking at a catalog of political influence, frankly. Who's got it? Who doesn't? Now, so when you then come back to the so in a way, you know, and there is a profound kind of disconnect here about what exactly we are talking about. When you look at the private sector bankruptcies or non-bankruptcies, the thing about all of these institutions is at some level they really had no choice. They're backed into a corner. They can't get the cash. They can't borrow the fund. They can't borrow the money. They can't sell the assets. They don't have any options. The whole nature of these fiscal crises is that is simply not true. I defy you to walk out of this building and take a little tour of the state of California and ask yourself the question, is there the wealth and the income in this political jurisdiction, right, to ensure that the firefighter who might come into this building and save your life gets an adequate pension? Or, to put it another way, because this is on the table, in Michigan, for example, to ensure that foster children are able to buy new clothes. You want to go down to the yacht basin in Santa Barbara and take a count of the boats and think about how many crippled firefighters each boat equals? This is not about the kinds of dilemmas that, for example, face the AIG board on the weekend of September 13th. Right? This is about political choices. And that's why, in a way, we are simply not having the right conversation when we start trying to shove that frame into the framework of what it is we need to do with private businesses. I think that's one conversation we're having, and the other conversation we're having is this profound and fascinating conversation about the relationship between state and federal finances in a society where we actually are kind of trying to have it both ways, and have been trying to have it both ways for a long time. And I would suggest that the real reason why my answer to the chancellor is right and Jonathan's is not is because of this very point that in the 1840s we stopped allowing states to do general obligation borrowing to fund their expenses. Sovereign entities do that. Sovereign entities have the capacity to borrow, right? And states do not. And I think the critical thing about Jonathan's narrative to understand is that the moment when we treated states as though they were sovereign entities for a time was in the 1840s, right? Before the little civics lesson that President Lincoln taught occurred.
Thank you. Ms. Goldstein, would you like to weigh in?
Yes. I'd like to point out, and I think I'm to some extent repeating what has already been said, but in my experience in representing companies that must evaluate whether or not to go into Chapter 11, that is their very last choice. No company takes advantage of Chapter 11 unless it absolutely has to. It goes into Chapter 11 for one of two reasons. One, there is no other access to liquidity, or two, it's about to be dismembered. That's the example, that's the example of a Texaco, which faced a judgment which might have caused dismemberment of assets. But most companies, it's a liquidity issue. So I agree that in terms of a state, it's hard to see that would be the choice. Also, I would point out that at least from the reading that I have done, state revenues do not, or at least the portion of state revenues that are required for debt service on this debt that we're talking about as possibly going into default is small, maybe 10%. So even if you had a state bankruptcy which allowed you to impair debt, how are you going to deal with the other elements of the fiscal crisis, with the programs that the state has to support, with the services that the state has to provide? Again, I think I'm just reiterating the point already made that the beneficiaries of those services at some point have to pay for them. How that's accomplished is a different political issue, but I do think that there is not enough analogy between the private sector and the governmental sector to make state bankruptcy a solution to what are probably temporary fiscal crises. I apologize. I only have access to the audio and this video conferencing facility in my firm for about another 5 minutes, so I'll be signing off probably around then, but thank you again.
Thank you very much. Professor, do you agree with Mr. Silvers that you're having the same conversation but are coming to a different conclusion? Or both, neither, or no.
It's complicated. I mean, I think you know, I'm trying to focus on, you know, I don't know, just my general approach to these things is to try to find a sort of to look for solutions that sort of get around a lot of the political rhetoric that these things ultimately in the United States in the era of polarization kind of seem to come down to. And so yes, in a way I think we are having the same conversation. But I don't hear you disagreeing with the notion that so there's a question of just there is a basic problem which is how to give states incentives to behave fiscally in a federation in which the central government is potentially left holding the bag. And the same situation exists between state governments and municipalities. And let us not forget that there are much more frequently bailouts of municipalities by states, Harrisburg being the most recent. In fact, this is why municipal debt ratings are generally, this is why people don't think municipalities are such a big risk, because people believe that they're implicitly backed up by the state governments. So I think this is something that can easily happen. I think that the possibility of a European-style moral hazard problem is real, and it's not to be discounted. And so I guess I'm focusing a bit more on that aspect of the problem. But I don't hear you disagreeing with the notion that default should be viewed as people should understand that default is a real possibility. And sort of a blanket assessment, an idea that the federal government sort of stands behind the debts of the states, kind of in this kind of time inconsistency problem. This is a big problem that needs to be solved, and there are kind of two ways to solve it. And whatever solution we end up adopting probably needs to make it clear that states can default.
Yeah, I disagree with the proposition that I disagree with the proposition that there is any likely scenario in the I disagree with the proposition the United States is a federation. It's not. It's a hybrid between effectively. Remember, we had something called the Articles of Confederation. The United States had a go at being a federation. That ended with the Civil War. After the Civil War, the United States is not a federation, but in various ways we continue to have some aspects of federation. I don't want to say federal, but federation-like governance. And I think that this issue of whether the federal government stands behind the state's debts is one of these areas where the duality or the ambiguity of this question is most present. So that clearly, if states can. There's no legal obligation on the part of the federal government to fund the debt of a state. I think that's well understood. What there is, because it's only been tested once since the Civil War, what there is apparently, to the extent the extent this question has been tested, the court system will force states to honor their obligations. The couple of occasions in which, Arkansas was one during the New Deal, during the Great Depression, the one or two occasions where a state actually tried to not pay its debt, not hand out script to be redeemed later or whatever, but does not pay, the court said you have to pay. You have to raise taxes, you have to find the funds. What that is a kind of backdoor way of saying basically a state can no more renege on its debts, right, than, for example, the history department here at Stanford University could renege on its debts. Right? That's not going to be allowed. We are going to enforce it, but through backdoor means. Now, it's nonetheless true that because we have this kind of implicit and sort of unclear legal regime in this area, that it's absolutely true that our bond markets and our CDS markets act as if the state obligations are different in their credit quality than federal government obligations. But there's an additional interesting way of thinking about this. If you look at the integration of the actual provision of government services between state and federal government, which Jonathan talked about, which I talked about, it's part of the reason why I say we're having the same conversation, because we see that as a central issue here. If you look at that and then you think about the following thing, the shortfall at the peak of this economic crisis, the shortfall in state budgets, and what exactly the relationship between state budgets and state spending is a fascinating conversation in and of itself. But the shortfall is $190 billion. That was the top. At the same time, right, the federal budget deficit during that period was on the order of $1.2, $1.5 trillion. A substantial part, not a substantial part, a very substantial part in terms of the impact on the states, but a relatively trivial part in terms of the federal government was transfer payments from the federal government to the states. So that it's in certain respects a misunderstanding to say, well, we have this profound state fiscal crisis, and then we have a federal government that borrows at a risk-free rate. Right? Whereas, in fact, what we have is an overall national fiscal crisis involving both the state fiscal climate involves both the states and the federal government, the federal government is able to borrow at a risk-free rate nonetheless, the lowest borrowing rate in the world, essentially, and can choose whether or not, how much of that money it wishes to pass down to the states. When it chooses not to do so, states don't have the option of going out really and borrowing themselves. When the federal government chooses not to do so, states do things like cut off the clothes to foster kids.
So the question is, what are the solutions to that problem? Again, I don't think this needs to be especially ideological. It's a basic problem people can agree on the right and the left. And I think, so one solution is what I would call the Canadian solution, which is the Canadian provinces borrow as sovereigns. They smooth their own cycles. They actually, the Ontario did its own stimulus. Funded with borrowing on credit markets and so forth. That's one option. I don't gather there's much support for that from any quarters. I haven't heard anyone suggest that that's the solution. So to me, the other one is just that whatever aspects of the U.S. of the federal expenditures that have been passed down to states over time, if there's going to be funded with transfers, then some mechanism, those transfers need to be less discretionary and less it shouldn't become a game of pork barrel sort of scrambling for, and this is how it plays out in the way of the U.S. Congress, with everyone kind of scrambling for some sort of a pork barrel project. It's our way of dealing with fiscal crises, and we deal with them after it's too late, and we deal with it through pork. Rather than a kind of policy that would actually make it possible, a sort of a transfer system that would make it possible for the foster kids to get new clothes. And again, I don't think this needs to be an ideological thing. It's something that I think people could agree on some mechanism for those transfers to be less ad hoc and pork-laden, and actually find, without even talking about whether they should be increased or decreased, just a more rational way of distributing resources. But this is.
For what it's worth, my presentation was entirely about the fact that those are the choices. Right? Yeah. I mean, if you come right down to it, either we recognize that the states are going to be counter-cyclical spenders, and we let them borrow in a sovereign fashion, right? Or we recognize that this is not an appropriate thing to ask states to do, right? And we move, and either through a fixed formula, a spending formula, or by federalizing, we move things like unemployment insurance and Medicaid to the federal government, either directly or indirectly by fixed formulas. I mean, those are the solutions over and above the question of simply, do we have are we adequately taxing ourselves given the level of public services and public goods that we desire? And I think the answer to that question is simply no. And the data on this is dramatic. But it's actually most dramatic at the federal level more than the state.
But there's a remaining question. If even if something about the transfer system could be fixed, if you want California to go and look at that yacht basin and figure out a way to extract some of that money and use it to give pensions to firefighters. How do you generate a system of incentives where California understands that it has to do that, and it can't just kind of continue to kind of hope that eventually there's going to be a federal solution? Because I think in many states it's an easy thing to do. Politicians are only in power for a short period of time, and so there are a lot of easy solutions involving shell games in state fiscal, state finance, in kind of underfunding your pension programs, which has been the most. Give generous contract to people, and then worry about someone else having to deal with it, and then don't fund the current. Just don't put any money into it. What is the solution to that set of problems? Is it a market-based or a hierarchical solution? And I guess at the end of the day, it seems to me the states have to, because you're willing to say the states are not sovereigns. Federalism is over with, and I think the states. That's been the beauty of American federalism, is it's been able to. The states do generally, at the end of the day, understand they have to deal with this stuff themselves, and if we shouldn't give up on that notion. Because it's been a powerful notion that has worked well for us, I think, since the 1840s, and that's where we might just disagree. I think it has, even though it's complicated, it's murky, I think it still basically works.
My response to that would be, if that's right, and I don't, that would argue for understanding that we need to move counter-cyclical expenditures to the federal level, because if you want states to be able to. If you want to have those expenditures, if you want, for example, Medicaid to expand when the number of poor people expands, all right, then assuming that you're not going to allow states to really become sovereign, right, to engage in in countercyclical borrowing for general expenditures, then you need to move that stuff up to the federal.
So you're saying, yeah, let the states be sovereign, but take Medicare,
Well,
take the stuff
those-
away from them.
Well,
because-
but let them be sovereign in this very limited sense, meaning that continue to preserve this ambiguity about technically what exactly would happen if a state chose not to pay. Now, I think what we know about the law is that if a state chose not to pay, not to honor an obligation, the party that was owed the money could walk into a court and force a payment. I think that and what I take away from that being basically the state of affairs is that when you look at CDS rates and the like, what those things are pricing is the fact that there are costs to all that stuff. There are costs, there are uncertainty, there are timing risks. That the fact that you may, in theory, get your principal back, right, as say a bondholder, should a state go down that kind of path, the fact that you may, in theory, get your principal back at some point does not mean you weren't hurt. Right? That's the best, given what we know about the facts of the United States over the last 150 years, that's the best way to read. That's the best way to read that type of market data. What I'm suggesting is I think that the choices you outline between essentially really moving to a federation, really treating states as sovereign fiscal entities that can borrow for whatever they want, right, is one option. And another option is recognizing that states are not sovereign fiscal entities and are not a good place to locate counter-cyclical spending responsibilities. Right? Those strike me as the choices that we really face here. And
I should just back to note that the balanced budget requirements are not federally imposed. They are the sovereign states have chosen to tie their hands in this way.
And yet no one has tried to no one's tried to back away from that. Now, part of the reason why they haven't was because during the time when during times when this has been up until now very present kind of issue, right? The federal government has stepped up and done the borrowing, pushed the money down.
We should try to leave a few minutes for questions. I must say one of the fascinating things here is what we've seen here, that you can't answer this question without at least provoking something really foundational. And as Damon put it quite well, we've got to decide exactly what kind of federal system we have here. And also just, notions like, well, there are things that are outside this question which are clearly part of the question. For example, the term limits issue obviously affects the question of the ability of legislators to take sufficient long-range views of it and so on. So I think we have 10 minutes or so for questions, and because we seem to have a lot, if we could keep them very short and in the interrogative. Peter, do we have a system? That's the crucial thing. Sure, just come on down, like in a game show. Come on down. And go ahead.
My name is Olivia Mitchell. I'm from the Wharton School and not a lawyer. I'll stipulate that at the beginning. I'm an economist, and for that reason, I would like to ask the folks up front, and perhaps anybody else, to comment on the fact that this really is not a question of cyclical responses. This is not a temporary financial crisis that we're going through and seeing the fruits of. If you take a much broader view, we're in a world where we have demographic aging, a dramatically new financial order, and I find a little bit quaint the approach where we are arguing about is it the federal or the state government that's going to help sort out these claims. We have experienced a tremendous decrease in wealth. It's going to be persistent. It's going to be perhaps recurrent. And so the question is not how do we muddle through with today's Medicaid payments. It's how do we recognize that we're facing a very much smaller pie, perhaps low or negative growth for many, many years to come, and a different position for both the country and the states in terms of what people are expecting.
My co-panelist has come up with an interesting suggestion in the name of efficiency, and that is maybe we actually have all the people standing up ask their questions, and then our panelists can respond as they wish, and that way at least everybody will get a few words in. So we'll just go back and forth. Bruce, and then Anat, go ahead.
Thank you. So this is a fascinating conversation. There are two aspects of the economics of borrowing that I haven't heard addressed. One is that we have a history in this country and globally of state-owned or country-owned banks, publicly owned banks. Bank of North Dakota exists, and 10 other states, to my knowledge, are studying or implementing that. I'd like your thoughts on the effect of partially privatized and partially public banking system And also, when you're answering that and the question of municipal bonds issued by states and localities, the effect and the dislocation, let's say, of the tax exemption for state funding versus federal funding. And third, there does not seem to be an economic model of here's our GDP, here's how fast it's growing, and here's the kind of financing we need on public and private side. I'm starting to build that model here at Stanford, and I'm a former, I graduated.
By the way, one more formal tweak. Peter suggested that although obviously if people need to step out at 10:30, please do so, but perhaps we can extend the semi-formal discussion here until 10:40. Anat?
I'm Anat Admati from the Stanford Business School. You touched a little bit, Damon, on banks and bailouts, but if you talk about the politics of this, and if you try to understand what's going on in Europe, it probably is important to bring the banks into this, because a number of us have been mystified by the willingness of Germany to go along, and when you think about this, somehow or other, you end up in the banks who own a lot of the Greek debts. And so the politics of this involves the politics of banking and banking regulations, especially after the crisis, something I've been involved in for a while. And in this country, I've been watching with great concern the banks getting into municipal lending, in fact, taking the place of household bonds. And you can trust them to find something. I bet you it has a low risk weight, and it's something that is a problem because, like in Europe, if it comes to bailing out municipalities, it would be about bailing out the banks in the end.
Sir?
Damon and Jonathan, you both touched on unfunded pension liabilities briefly, and my question is, this number of the value of the unfunded liabilities, if you switch from the 8% return assumptions that people are using now to something like the risk-free rate, which some have advocated, your liability number can be as high as $3 trillion, which is essentially the size of the entire municipal bond market. I wanted to get your opinion on how significant that liability is and how it affects your view of the attractiveness of state bankruptcy as an option. And also if we have any precedent or any sense of how pension obligations would be treated in a type of bankruptcy proceeding. For example, if they'd be subjected to the automatic stay along with general obligation debt, if they would be treated more like special revenue obligations where payment has to proceed under the bankruptcy. And also, Damon, just as another point, you mentioned kind of the relative importance of where the money is going. You mentioned firefighter pensions and things of that sort. California is an example. Even though the state does have taxing power, it's limited by certain constraints where you need this 2/3 voting. And I just wanted to get your honest opinion. Do you think there ever could be a point at which a state becomes insolvent and really just does not have the money and cannot raise the money to meet its obligations?
Okay, we'll accumulate two more questions with both from lawyers from the law firm of McConnell and McConnell, I guess.
So Michael McConnell from the law school here. I'm intrigued by the fact that both Damon and Jonathan are talking about lifting the budget, balanced budget limitations at the states. And the reason I'm curious about that is it seems as though that's not so much the Ontario solution as it is the Greece solution. And because I'm worried about I thought one of the recent lessons of the EU crisis is that when entities are able to run their own fiscal policy, including borrowing, but don't run their monetary policy, that is, they don't have their own currency, that mismatch is a disaster. And it would seem to me that that would be exactly what we'd be introducing if we lifted the balanced budget caps for the states.
Okay. Final question?
So my understanding from a federalism theory is that the reason why it's so valuable to have transfer payments at the federal level is that states have a much narrower tax base, or just too small entities to sustain large borrowing, and that it's very hard to maintain transfer payments because wealth is highly mobile. And so why is it that California, which actually does have basically all these characteristics that most large nations have, is the main crisis, rather than, say, Mississippi?
California, but so I won't go for that one. But I guess one thing that just I didn't mean to say, just in response to I think several people, when I showed that graph of debt GDP ratios in Europe and the U.S., the point was not that the U.S. states are not in deep trouble, and I do think so. I'm not kind of part of this. I'm not trying to downplay the extent of the problem, and it is difficult to get good data. It's difficult to get believable data about what exactly some of the hidden obligations are. And when you really start, digging into the weeds and trying to understand how this works in a bunch of different states, you get increasingly scared. And there are a number of big problems. But yeah, so the idea of, I guess I'm not trying to go on record as pushing for getting rid of the balanced budget requirements. That really wasn't my intention. It's just what I'm trying to highlight is that there is, I think we agree on this tension between the notion of treating states as sovereigns, and you can tell I sort of like many aspects of that when it comes to enforcing fiscal discipline. I think market discipline at the state level has worked well for a long time, and I don't want to screw it up. And the wrong kinds of federal policies, I think, would screw it up. And so I think allowing everyone to believe that the federal government, is sort of responsible for the obligations of the states is something, a situation I don't want to create. I don't think we need to do that. So there is this kind of tension between a situation in which we think the states are sovereign, but yet one in which they're not able to conduct countercyclical fiscal policy, but yet many aspects of the welfare state are under control of the states. That is a sort of a mismatch, and it's a tension, and there's got to be some, I was just trying to raise that as kind of an underlying issue that may not seem to be the issue, but it actually is an important issue. But an interesting question about state banks. I mean, there is this interesting movement. The United States is really kind of going against the trend here. I mean, if you want to, I'm not crazy about the idea of state-owned banks. I mean, if you want to understand the kind of, it's true that essentially the bailout of Greece was a bailout of German banks, and that we should be perfectly clear about that. The externalities, what didn't happen in the 1840s, was not the case that the debt of Pennsylvania was owned by some big American banks that were located in New York. And so the problem in Brazil was that the state bank that was owned by the state of Sao Paulo, called Banespa, is the largest bank in Brazil. And the main thing it had on its books was bad debt to the state of Sao Paulo. And so this is why the Brazilian government had to bail out Sao Paulo, and then it eventually went down this path of bailing out all the states. And similar things happened in Argentina, and this is a big reason why these countries had the macroeconomic crises that they had in the 1990s. Actually, state banks are being privatized around the world for exactly this reason, and there's a great deal of pressure on the Germans to privatize the Landesbank sector. There's been a lot of reluctance to this, and there's been allegations. It's hard to get data, but there's a lot of allegations of kind of connected inside dealing and sort of loans made to real estate entities that are friendly with the mayor, who's on the board of the Landesbank. That's the kind of thing you get into, and so I'm not particularly fond of the idea of going that route. I think I should probably stop there. Lots of other interesting points, but
I mean, it's really a great set of questions. I can't help but observe that if you look at the credit reports of the six largest financial institutions, the six dominant financial institutions in the United States, they each have a little box in them that says that, but for the implicit government guarantee, the rating would be 5 notches lower. Right? That is, I'm not sure if that's what the individual who asked about government-owned banks was asking about, but I think that is the reality of state-owned enterprises or state-guaranteed enterprises in the United States. And that's an interesting kind of, I think it's hard to justify that it's hard to justify that state of affairs from any kind of consistent sort of principled sort of position, of left or right. I think you can't really explain that as a good thing. There's a whole set of questions here that really go to the following issue. what do we need to do to see to it that, that the United States has the sort of future, this is a meta question, the United States has the sort of future we would want it to have? My friend from Wharton talked about tremendous decreases in wealth, low and negative growth. Right? That's not a future we want. Right? It may, whether it's avoidable or not is another question, but it's certainly not desirable. And it connects with the question about risk-free rates. You see that the argument it's really being made by advocates that we ought to evaluate pension obligations and the sufficiency of the assets to back them using a risk-free rate are essentially arguing that that we really can't expect capital markets conditions in the foreseeable future to resemble those of the long-term past. Now, one explanation for that would be that that unlike the last 200 years, the next 20 or 30 years, the next 100 years, for systems like, say, CalPERS or CalSTRS that are very long-term horizons, that these are going to be terrible. Right? This is going to be a period like the fall of the Roman Empire. Right? And so, we really just got to expect that the best solution, the best way to manage money is to do what people did during the fall of the Roman Empire, which is to bury it. Right, in the ground. I mean, that's essentially what, the risk, when you say that when we project pension obligations, when we project pension finances into the future, we do so at a risk-free rate, we're essentially saying that we don't expect it's going to be possible to generate the kinds of long-term returns that it's been possible to do in the last 200 years in the future. Now, how do we avoid that type of future? That is, the point was made, well, these piddling questions about Medicaid. Well, it ain't piddling if you're on Medicaid, but there is a point here about the larger question really in play in this discussion, as in so many others, is what is the set of policies that, in a globalized environment, can produce in the United States a future that we would like to have for ourselves and our children? Critical to that are two things, in my opinion. Maybe you could, choose what's important to you. What seems important to me is, A, that we actually look after people in our society who need to be looked after, who need help. B, that we treat fairly people we ask a lot of, right? That we're able to do those things. And by treat fairly people we ask a lot of, I mean things like, are we going to go renege on pension commitments to firefighters? Now, but the third thing, which is kind of a precondition for all this, is can we fund things like infrastructure investment? Leaving aside whether we have intelligent ways of deciding how to make those investments, or whether it's captured by various meretricious political and personal dynamics, the question is, can we fund them? Can we fund basic public goods and basic public services? And the story you're hearing today is a story about a political process at the state and at the federal level that has systematically failed to do that over time. That is essentially in the mode of, we hate taxes and yet we want services. We hate taxes and yet we want first-class infrastructure. We hate taxes and yet we want economic growth. Right? We've got to get past that into a place where we can invest in, where we can have a modern state and modern levels of public good investment, or we will be doomed to a long-term future of low and negative economic growth, decreasing wealth, and increasing inequality, while our competitors globally, who do not have this problem, who understand the connection between for example, between public good investment and economic growth, are doing just that in places like Germany and China, and even to some degree India. Although, on the public services side, not so much. But the countries that are really being successfully competitive with us and whose future looks bright are countries that do not have this particular kind of delusion dominating their public discourse.
Well, we should wrap up. I should say, on the one hand, I despair even more as I think about the actual level of public discourse that's going on out there right now as compared to what we hear now. For example, in one of the most profound statements I've ever heard in discussions of the federal deficit, we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem, which I think, is interesting because it's a profound, abolition or repeal of the laws of arithmetic. Seems to be a question beggar. better. Plus, I should simply point out that it has been well established in public discourse that Mr. Silvers is engaged in class warfare, and to which he might proudly agree. But in any event, I actually am very optimistic about the possibilities of really, provocative and constructive public discourse given what we've heard today. So I thank our panelists and our questioners.